Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's National Day of Remembrance program. My name is Len Bai, and I am a program coordinator at the Washington State Historical Society. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Washington State Historical Society is located on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we pay respect to their elders past and present. I would also like to thank everyone who has participated in our online programming these last few years. Please visit our website at Washington History for information on upcoming exhibitions and programs. The museum is currently open to view all of our exhibitions, including the 4th grade project and all the sacrifices you've made, todos los sacrificios que has hecho. And as we begin to pivot back to in-person programming, please consider becoming a member. I'll post a link in the chat to learn how. Tonight's program includes a presentation by Lisa Hoffman and Mary Hanneman titled Structural Erasure, Remembering Japanese Americans in Pre-War Tacoma, presented in partnership with UW Tacoma. Following the presentation, our lead curator, Gwen Whiting, will introduce the documentary Fujitaro Kubota and His Garden. Please stay after the film for a discussion, including a Q&A with Joy Okazaki and Mayumi Tsutakawa. And to start the program, please welcome UW Tacoma Associate Teaching Professor of History and Global Studies, Libby Sunderman.
Thank you, Lynn. And I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight for Scholarly Selections. It's a community-oriented lecture series coordinated by the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at UW Tacoma, and of course, the Washington State History Museum. I'm really excited to welcome our speakers tonight and to participate in this National Day of Remembrance program. And let me introduce our speakers quickly. Lisa M. Hoffman is a cultural anthropologist and professor of urban studies at the University of Washington, Tacoma. She is the author of Patriotic Professionalism in Urban China, Fostering Talent and Spaces of Danger, Culture and Power in the Everyday. And Mary L. Hanneman is a historian of modern Japan and professor of modern East Asian history at the University of Washington, Tacoma. And she is the author of Japan Faces the World, 1925 to 1952, and Hasegawa, Nizokan, and Liberalism in Modern Japan. And they are the co-authors of Becoming Nisei, Japanese American Urban Lives in Prewar Tacoma, which was published recently by the University of Washington Press, a book based on interviews with Nisei, who grew up in Tacoma, as well as archival research. And we wanted to remind you that if you're interested, you can purchase the book, and there's a discount code, which Len is gonna put in the chat, but I'll just tell you real quick, you enter W193 for a 30% discount at the UW Press website for their book. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our speakers, Lisa and Mary.
Thank you so much, Libby. We really appreciate all of your organization work, and also to the Washington State Historical Society for hosting these events and collaborating with UW Tacoma. I'm going to do a screen share here and turn us into the slideshow. There we go. So in the past several months in Tacoma, 6 different Asian restaurants have been vandalized. Viendong, Asian Street Eatery, and even Indochine across the street from the Washington State Historical Society. There was also an attack on an elderly Asian couple in South Tacoma in November of 2021. In this map, we have added the locations of these sites in red. The other sites marked by black dots represent Japanese residences, organizations, and businesses between the 1910s and 40. The reappearance of violence against Asians in an urban landscape dominated by structural and historic erasure of these communities should not be a surprise. Indeed, anti-Asian violence in cities has increased dramatically in recent years. In fact, Stop Asian Hate reports that almost 1 in 5 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced a hate incident in the last year, and that the majority of these are in public places. Here you can see as the total number of hate crimes has decreased in 19 to 20, there's a dramatic increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. While newspaper articles about these attacks in Tacoma reference the police as saying they were not considering the incidents a hate crime at this point, we argue that the juxtaposition of then and now, as noted here, accentuates the need to unsettle such situated ignorances. This is especially important at the time of the 80th anniversary of National Remembrance Day, when Executive Order 9066 was signed. This juxtaposition of the pre-war community in Tacoma and current anti-Asian violence, we hope, disrupts and unsettles our passively accepted narratives of urban development. It matters that we're seeing this again, here, and now. Such a juxtaposition might help us to have insight into what is really going on, the perpetuation of systemic racism through collective amnesia. This forgetting, reproduced again and again, fuels what we refer to in the book as the structural erasure of the pre-war Japanese community in Tacoma, which in its pre-war heyday had close to 2,000 residents. Structural erasure refers to processes that have transformed Tacoma, here at 13th and Broadway, 1940, the heart of Nihonmachi, or the Japantown, to this. And this is looking at Broadway from 15th to 13th. Such transformations are rarely analyzed through the systemic practices that have produced these erasures, processes of obliteration that are both symbolic and clearly material. The disappearance of homes, businesses, and even prominent buildings such as the Tacoma Japanese Language School are not simply about progressive development, but are rather due to specific policies like alien land laws established in the 1920s that forbid first-generation Japanese immigrants, Nisei, who are classified as aliens ineligible for citizenship, from owning land. We also have to recognize the restrictive immigration rules that barred immigrants to the US from Japan, and of course, the FBI arrests, the Executive Order 9066, and wartime incarceration. Occupying an alien status in the US, what critical scholar Aiko Day calls a form of Jim Crow in a transnational context, certainly facilitated the later erasure of these urban residents and landscapes. And here we can see this in Tacoma. In fact, it was because the language school building was in a state of disrepair, and an historic preservation study determined that renovations could not restore its historic value and integrity, that it was torn down by UW Tacoma in 2004. This decision propelled Mary and me into this project, and we set out to interview the Nisei, the second generation Japanese Americans, who had lived in Tacoma and attended the language school prior to the war. Most of the Issei and Nisei who lived in Tacoma prior to the war did not return after release from incarceration in 1945. And in fact, the War Relocation Authority had a policy of dispersal across the country in order not to recreate these concentrated communities. So we traveled to Chicago, Oakland, and Los Angeles for interviews. One of the Nisei that we interviewed, Mr. Kaz Harita, explained the impact of this erasure. Quote, "All of the old landmarks are gone. Our old home and place of business, gone, are both empty lots. The highway markets where the Japanese Americans did well, it's all built up, and I only located them due to the fine work of our tour guides. The tide flats where we played ball and where Tokyo Beach was located, it's all filled and industrialized. I felt a lump, a downfall in feeling," unquote. Other Nisei we interviewed remembered exact addresses, creating points of reflection on their own subjectivity. One woman, for instance, remembered that her family had lived at 1746 Fawcett, now an empty lot owned by UW Tacoma. Quote, "It was the same block as the Buddhist church," she said, "and the block after would be, I guess, 19th, and right at the corner was a Methodist church, the Japanese Methodist church." They recalled the rich variety of businesses, including a barber shop that, as Yoneko Auchi said, pointing to a map, "Koko nari wa," it was right here, right next to Mori-san. That location is now a parking lot for the Murano Hotel. Of the 40 discrete buildings mentioned 3 or more times by the Nisei we interviewed, by 2018, and according to research done by then graduate student Sarah Pyle, 36 of the 40 were either vacant or parking lots. So as Kaz Harita said, it creates a downfall in feeling, for memories and the self are also spatially constructed. Thus, the erasure of the built landscape may be experienced as an erasure of the self and one's belonging. As built landscapes change, memories and personal histories, which are rooted in place, may be silenced and forgotten. Urban development narratives of future-oriented excitement, in fact, rely on the continuous silencing of specific histories and belongings, supporting an urbanism that suggests, to quote other scholars, to remain attractive for capital, these spaces must remain hidden in the landscape, unquote. We thus have understood the narratives in the interviews as spatial stories that reconstructed the self and community on their own terms. So along with the juxtaposition of then and now as we opened this evening, we understand the Nisei's interview narratives as a kind of speaking back and revisibilizing what has been erased. Such practices also have the potential power to disrupt and unsettle our collective ignorances, simultaneously destabilizing progressive narratives of urban development that benefits some and not others.
So February 19th is the Day of Remembrance, and this marks the day that President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which allowed the US government to round up and incarcerate people of Japanese ancestry residing in the western portions of Washington, Oregon, and California. Ironically, the Tacoma Japanese Language School building, which functioned not only as a school, but also as a kind of a community center, was used as the civilian control center, where Japanese were required to register for incarceration. They then left from Union Station, located right next door to the Washington State History Museum, and were first sent to the Pinedale Assembly Center, and then on to Tule Lake. FBI surveillance of this community had already begun in 1932, and in the days after Pearl Harbor, various leaders of Tacoma's Japanese community were picked up by the FBI. 22 of those leaders in Tacoma were arrested, including Masato Yamasaki, who was principal of the Tacoma Japanese Language School. Principal Yamasaki was arrested. He was sent to Fort Missoula Detention Camp in Montana, then on to Lordsburg, New Mexico, where he was placed in the US Army internment camp. And he died there tragically in March of 1943. So yes, we must remember these stories, these atrocities, these events. It is essential that we understand and study the pre-war social worlds of the Japanese community in the United States. So much of the literature on Japanese American experience treats the interwar period as little more than an interlude between 1924 exclusion and incarceration in 1942. We argue, though, that this period is not just an interlude, but rather was a very important time of creating the community, a time during which the Japanese community built a robust social world where families lived, worked, ran their businesses, and where children learned and played. So by focusing on this pre-war period, we really want to highlight the agency of Japanese Americans, even though at the same time we have to recognize their lack of power in shaping belonging in the United States. So to more fully understand the extent of the loss of Tacoma's Japanese community and the Tacoma community as a whole, let's listen to this clip from our interview with Dr. Ryo Munakata, where he provides by memory a summary of one small portion of that area from 13th to 15th on Broadway that Lisa showed a picture of earlier. So let's listen to what Dr. Munakata has to say.
Let's see. And next door to that was a Japanese confection store, and they also sold Japanese magazines and books. And next to that, there was a family named Takahashi that ran a grocery store. The next to that was a rice bowl Chinese food place run by a Chinese family. And next to that was a Mr. Hoshide's pharmacy drugstore. And those stores were in a building on the corner of 15th and Broadway. And it's called New Washington Hotel. and it was run by a family named Suyama. And very corner, first floor, was another food stand, ice cream fountain, and in the back was a pool room, and run by a family named Obayashi, I think it was. And on the side that I lived, there were less. But I remember a drugstore on the corner where we, as a child, we'd go there and buy something, and the druggist would give us a piece of candy. And then, so when we needed something from the drugstore, we always volunteered. And then further down the street, my father had his new Tacoma hotel. And then there was a photographer. There was another barber shop. And next to that, there was a tailor shop by the family of Nakata, named Nakata. And then further down the street, there was a family that had a gift shop. They also sold fishing tackle. And by gift, I mean, not small gifts, but they were very elaborate and expensive gifts. And the name was Mr. Niyama, Niiyama. And then we go down the street, there was a market, another Chinese food restaurant. And then there was a shoe repair store that also sold new shoes. And the man's name was Mr. Kawai. And in fact, his son is here for the And then at the corner was a dry goods store. And somewhere in between there was Mr. Fukui, who had a weekly Japanese newspaper. That's just one block.
That's incredible.
It's always so amazing to hear the way he can remember all of that just from one building to the next. Amazes me. So understanding Tacoma's history adds to our overall understanding of the pre-war experiences of the Issei and the Nisei more broadly. So we want to kind of talk about some of the elements that were unique about Tacoma, about the Tacoma situation, the Tacoma Japanese community in the pre-war period. So to understand the importance of Tacoma's former Japanese community and to underscore what Lisa has been talking about in terms of the erasure of this community, we can note an observation made by Tacoma historian Michael Sullivan, who found that according to 1920 US Census data, Tacoma's Japanese population constituted the largest percentage of any American city at that time, relative to the overall population of Tacoma. So this means that there was a comparatively large and therefore significant Japanese immigrant population in pre-war Tacoma, even though it was not the largest community in absolute numbers compared to Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Seattle. So as you can see in the slide, some of these numbers, but Asian American Americanist Roger Daniels has called Los Angeles the chief city for Japanese Americans in the pre-war period, with over 30,000 Japanese residents in the 1930s. In San Francisco, with about 5,000, was considered the cultural hub. But Seattle, with about 7,000 Japanese residents, was kind of considered, Daniels called it the real second city of Japanese America. By way of comparison, Tacoma had a Japanese population of close to 2,000 residents in its most vibrant period in the late 1920s. Only Stockton, Sacramento, Portland, Oregon, and New York City had as many as 1,000 Japanese in their pre-war Japanese communities. That gives you a sense of how significant actually the Tacoma Japanese population and community was. And because of this, in the 1890s, the Japanese government was quite interested in Tacoma. Several important Japanese shipping companies operated at the port in Tacoma, and in the early 1870s, the Northern Pacific Railroad had selected Tacoma as its Pacific terminus. So the Japanese government therefore studied Tacoma as a potential site for locating a consulate, conducting a study in which one Japanese government official described Tacoma as, quote, having a gentleness amongst cities of the Pacific coast. Historian Ronald Magden's research suggests that Tacoma's Japanese residents had a reputation of being virtuous, in contrast to the, quote, gamblers and prostitutes of Seattle, Portland, and Spokane. As a result of these studies, the Japanese consulate established its office in Tacoma in 1895, and it remained in Tacoma until it was relocated to Seattle 6 years later in 1901. In order to understand the significance of the Japanese consulate to the local community, we need to remember and understand that people of Japanese descent were not allowed to be naturalized as US citizens, and this remained the case until 1952. And so Japanese remained citizens, or more accurately subjects of the Japanese emperor, and therefore by necessity had to maintain an official connection with their home government. There were major labor contractors that had established themselves in Seattle and Tacoma in the late 19th century, especially to recruit laborers for the logging industry. And by 1900, almost half of the over 12,000 Japanese who were admitted to the country entered through the Pacific Northwest. Many Nisei worked in the fishing and lumber industries. And for instance, in 1917, in Tacoma alone, there were approximately 50 sawmills that employed about 1,300 workers. And by 1922, that had increased to around 2,000. And what we discovered in our research is that several Japanese families lived and worked on the tide flats. And here you can see a map of the tide flats area in Tacoma and where some of the Japanese families lived. Most of the Japanese community, however, lived in Tacoma's downtown core, the area that Munakata was talking about. And Tacoma's downtown core developed particularly in the 1920s, when changes in US immigration law, the Reed-Johnson Act or Exclusion Act of 1924, essentially ended new Japanese immigration to the United States. This contributed to a transition in the community from kind of single laborer, male laborer phase to a settled family phase. Single men who had engaged in the lumber and fishing industries began starting families and moving into small business ownership and entrepreneurialism. Just before World War II, for example, over 40% of the Nisei operated their own businesses or farms. One example of this kind of trajectory was the family of one man we interviewed, Perry Yoshiaki Yano. Yano's family had arrived in Seattle, Yano's father had arrived in Seattle in 1906, and he owned a pool hall with a friend. But when his wife arrived, they started working on farms, then moved into vegetable delivery business, and finally they opened a market in Tacoma. This kind of represents that transition from frontier to settler family phase. Residential hotels were an idiosyncratic business for Seattle's Japanese, and the same was true in Tacoma. These hotels catered largely to white male laborers. The hotel business allowed for the strategic deployment of labor by gender, as women could work in the hotels and take care of their families at the same time, because typically families lived in the hotels themselves. Barbershops were another business in the Tacoma Japanese community that were largely run by women. Dr. Munakata even said that as a young person, he thought that barbers were all women. Such was the nature of the community here. Also significant to centering Tacoma's Japanese community, primarily in the downtown core, was the fact that Tacoma had a single secular Tacoma Japanese Language School. This language school was located at the southern end of the downtown core at 17th and Tacoma Avenue. Unlike the many other cities on the West Coast and in Hawaii, Tacoma's Japanese residents decided to establish just one language school and make it a secular language school, not affiliated with either the Buddhist or the Christian churches. This was due largely, but not entirely, to the size of the community, which was neither too small nor too large. As Kimiko Fujimoto Tambara explained, quote, the community was opposed to opening more than one school because it would separate the community into two groups. There weren't enough students. It's better to be in one group and do it well Tacoma Japanese Language School brought children together across religious and prefectural lines. As Kimiko explained, there weren't that many subgroups in Tacoma. So the Tacoma Japanese Language School was first opened in 1911 in rented rooms. And in 1914, a school support society was established and fundraising began. And we have this image now that you see is an image of the fundraising letter that was used to solicit funds from the local Japanese community. Lisa and I found this in the UW Library Special Collections. A permanent building, after fundraising was completed, a permanent building was built, and that building was opened in 1923. And it operated as the Tacoma Japanese Language School until the incarceration of the Japanese forced its closure in 1942. But the building remained standing in its location at 17th and Tacoma Avenue until 2004, when it was demolished as part of the UWT campus expansion.
So the language school itself was then a really important site in the daily lives of the young Nisei. It was both identifiably different from the rest of the local urban world and a safe and familiar place for them. Their daily paths going from home to American public school to the Japanese language school intersected at this site and thus solidified the language school's place in bringing the community together and enhancing what many of the Nisei interviewees identified as a special closeness in Tacoma. And here's another map from the book that shows the daily paths from 5 different households, and they are intersecting here at the Tacoma Japanese Language School every day. So through these daily walking paths, they help to write the city on their own terms, as they also experience prevailing power relations of a segregated city and alien land laws. Their walking scale lives underscore how the young Nisei's own sense of self was built up in these everyday spatial practices. Walking to and from the Japanese language school reinforced the prominence of this institution for the children, a place where friendships were not necessarily divided by religious or prefectural kin association. So while the parents may have been more separated because of these differences, as Mary was noting, the Japanese American children in Tacoma all knew each other through the school. Studies of Seattle's Nikkei community have emphasized the role of churches, kin or prefectural associations, and even the labor boss system that worked through place-based affiliations. But in Tacoma, it seems that the Japanese language school played a more significant role. So the language that some of the interviewees used helps to reflect this. Sally Someko Shirasago, for instance, said she called the school a good gathering place for all of us. All of us had a place to go, and they had something going on often. Jerry Takao Kikuchi said, one thing all the Japanese that lived in Tacoma, they all attended the Japanese school. That's what held the Japanese community together. Shizu Tomita Takaoka said that the language school was kind of like a second home. It was our playground where all of us kids used to meet. And Takeshi Osada was emphatic that Tacoma was unique because the language school was secular. He said every other Japanese community has a Japanese school, but they all split into Buddhist and Christian. Here, everybody came to this one school. And so when we went to camp, we didn't have any Buddhist and Christian divide. Of course, other factors beyond the singular school shaped this community. The use of kinship relations when building small businesses meant that the economic conditions also supported what they experienced as closeness. Hotels, markets, and other businesses drew on nearby kin for inexpensive labor. Children would work at markets over the summer or go to pick berries at Japanese farms to help support their families. Prefectural associations also supported businesses with Tonomoshi, a rotating credit system that worked through the pooling of funds that are given to one family at a time to start a business. In addition, the size of Tacoma's Japanese population, as well as its marked concentration in one part of the city, meant it was large enough to have a vibrant economy, but small enough to know people. Evidence of this closeness was also in the fact that the Tacoma community, was was one of the first to have a group reunion in 1977, and an organizer was Kazuhita, one of the people that we interviewed. He wrote about this in the Japanese American Citizens League paper, Pacific Citizen. In our interview with him, he explained, our population wasn't that big. We had knowledge of, even if only by name, of all the families around there. And for a reunion, all of a sudden we became a family. Now contrast that to the other community that I know pretty well, which is Seattle. Seattle can't have a reunion because, well, why? Because there are groups. If one little group says we're going to have a reunion, well, the people there belong to such and such a church or something like that. I think you can accomplish it, but they can't accomplish a big one. Tacoma can. And then I'm just going to read this paragraph here from the article that he wrote about the experience of that first reunion. This was the start of an abrupt journey into the pre-World War II years. Hi, remember me? Boy, he sure looks like his father did. What's happened during these 35 years? I thought he was planning to be a minister. Can't believe he's a teacher now. He sure gave the teachers a hard time in his youth. She really looks great, hasn't hardly aged. My apologies for the bad time I gave you. You know, boys teasing girls. You were such a naughty boy then. There were just so many reminiscent remarks and quick impressions. It was magic. A number of the Nisei also noted what was special about growing up in Tacoma by comparing their experiences to those of Nisei from other places in the United States. The three Fujimoto sisters, they're all from the Fujimoto family, which was a prominent family in Tacoma and had a house directly across the street from the Buddhist temple, and it's now an empty site, talked about this in a comparison with Nisei from California.
I always felt that we were one of the lucky ones because our community was so united and we all knew each other and we helped each other. Whereas in California, and even in Seattle, the population of the Japanese is so much larger that they didn't have that privilege of being united, I don't think. But I think we were lucky. Yeah.
Like they say, it's only Tacoma that can have those big reunions, Japanese reunions, yes, because we're so close knit. We knew everybody.
And a lot of that, I think we owe to our principal, Japanese school principal, because he really steered us all into the right direction. Yeah.
When you say that, you mean, it sounds like you mean not just the students, but the
whole
The
family.
parents.
Oh, yeah, because they used to have PTAs all the time, and I think the parents were equally told how to behave and you know all that. So
Yeah, I thought every Japanese was good. And when I went into camp and saw some of them, I thought, wow. They have different kinds too.
yeah,
It's
With our
because
school activities, Mr. Yamasaki always invited our public school principal and the superintendent. They're all in the picture. Yeah.
I had always
Dr. Ryo Munakata also did this kind of a comparison with his experience of seeing other Japanese Americans in California.
You know, we'd go to the public schools, classes start anywhere around 8:30, and it would finish around 3 o'clock. And then between 3 and 4, we either had to go home and then go to the language school, or we went directly. And if we did go home, we'd find time to pick up something to munch on. And you'd pick it up and then start walking to school, and whatever you have in your hand, you're eating it. And I well remember our teacher saying, it's not proper to be standing, let alone walking, to be eating food. And that's so sometimes we cheat and we put something in our food and are walking the street, you try not to move your jaw along. And when I think of that, like I mentioned about 13th to 15th and the merchants, the owner of the business would be standing right there in the store, and they would be looking out. And as we walk the street, you see them, and they know you, and I know them. You must bow your head and acknowledge. You just couldn't walk by without acknowledging each other. So when I went to California, it was nothing for the people in California to walk and see another Japanese American fellow, a person, and not bow, because they're really strangers. But I grew up in a community where we knew each other, so invariably we would bow and acknowledge. And so to me, it was strange when they couldn't acknowledge each other. But, well, that's a
So as these clips show in both the Fujimoto sisters and Dr. Munakata, the Tacoma Nisei identity was intimately linked with their experiences in Tacoma, and we argue at the Tacoma Japanese Language School. What happened at school brought the Nisei children together and contributed to the processes that shaped their identities as Nisei. So as we've noted, the Tacoma Japanese Language School was a single secular school, in contrast with most Japanese language schools in Hawaii and on the US West Coast. The decisions to make a singular secular school were made by the community. Among the key leaders of the community was the Tacoma Japanese Language School principal, Masato Yamasaki, whose wife, Kuniko Yamasaki, was the school's first teacher. And the Fujimoto sisters mentioned the principal in their little clip that we just saw. Together, Masato and Kuniko Yamasaki shaped the educational mission and philosophy of the Tacoma Japanese Language School. Both Mr. and Mrs. Yamasaki were born in Japan in the 1870s. This was in the early years of Japan's important and transitional Meiji period. They were married prior to migrating to the United States. Masato arrived in Seattle in 1908, and his wife Kuniko followed in 1910. They relocated to Tacoma when Kuniko was hired to be the first teacher of the Tacoma Japanese Language School in 1912. As children of Meiji Japan, they brought with them the ethos of a modernizing Japan that nevertheless valorized important traditional values, as represented in the Imperial Rescript on Education, which you can see in the slide here. The Rescript on Education was a document issued by the Japanese government in 1890 that was designed to inculcate in the Japanese certain values, such as filial piety, self-discipline, hard work, sacrifice, traditional values that would ironically help to aid the nation in its effort to modernize. In Japan, the Rescript was recited every day by school children, and at the Tacoma Japanese Language School too, this document was made a focal point of various ceremonies, including the Emperor's birthday, New Year's Day celebrations, and other school events. The Nisei whom we interviewed particularly recalled the underlying message of their ethical education when they emphasized both at home and school that what was emphasized at both home and school, which was never to bring shame to the family and never to bring shame to the community. So as Dr. Munakata indicated in his little clip that we played, the Nisei children attended the Tacoma Japanese Language School every day after school, Monday through Friday, from 4 to 6 p.m. And almost without exception, the Tacoma Nisei did attend the Japanese Language School. After a day spent in the public schools, they would head home, grab a snack, and show up for 2 more hours of education, 2 more hours of school. And you can see the interior shots of the school here. They had a stage, multi-purpose room, and so on. At school, the Tacoma Japanese Language School, they engaged in a rigorous curriculum in Japanese language, history, culture, including cultural arts like calligraphy, traditional folk tales, and so on. This Japanese language curriculum in particular was rigorous And in fact, Tacoma Japanese Language School alums were known for their Japanese language ability. During the interviews, it was apparent that this group knew Japanese well, and they felt comfortable communicating with one another in Japanese. As Taiko Hoshiwara Taniguchi said, quote, Japanese from Tacoma could speak Japanese pretty well. When the Tacoma people got together, we were able to speak Japanese all the time. We spoke Japanese. The Tacoma Japanese Language School used textbooks and other materials ordered directly from Japan. These are things that we found in the in the UW special collections. What's on the screen right now is the cover of a student magazine that the students produced. This one from 1925. We also found other records like report cards, teachers' notes on pedagogy, student attendance records. We also found copies of essays written in Japanese, such as this one by Yoneko Aochi, who was one of our interviewees, that is entitled, Why is Japanese Language Important? Among other things, in this short essay, Yoneko comments that if their parents, who were not allowed to become US citizens, were ever forced to leave the United States and had to return to Japan, they, as children, would have to accompany their parents. So they had better know how to speak Japanese and function in Japanese society. So this shows the Nisei awareness of their parents' unstable and uncertain status in the United States.
Becoming Nisei was a contested and ongoing process that was both transnational and spatial. We've argued that space and place are not simply locations in which social life occurs. Rather, they are cultural processes and forms of power and essential components of the social and the subject, indeed of the city itself. This final slide shows a photo of the Hiroshima Hotel on the corner of 15th and Market. The photo's description in the Tacoma Public Library collection notes that when this photograph was taken in 1941, the hotel was named the Baker Hotel and was operated by Seiichi Kano. In June 1942, it was remodeled by the Tacoma Central Labor Council, who purchased the building in 1941, but it was demolished during urban renewal in the 1960s. Just noting, this is at the corner of 15th and Market in downtown Tacoma. Such urbanization practices are not simply about renewal or development, but are actively suppressing some narratives of belonging while highlighting others. And so on the other side, we note the Tacoma Japanese Language School and a photo that was taken in the 2000s. For Japanese Americans, wartime incarceration was nothing less than the spatial and economic destruction of the community. As Issei could not own land, businesses and possessions were abandoned, given away, and expropriated. Such collective exclusion rendered Tacoma's downtown core ripe for exploitation and development that indeed relied on the elimination of this community and continued silencing of this history. It was not simply development that led to the deterioration of the Tacoma Japanese Language School, a central place and institution in the pre-war Japanese Issei and Nisei social worlds. Rather, we want to note that it was the anti-Asian legislation and wartime incarceration, as well as our own ongoing processes of collective amnesia, that uphold structural erasure and invisibilize the lives and contributions of Japanese Americans, until, like a thunderbolt, violence and hate incidents jolt us into recognition. So on the eve of Remembrance Day, let us not forget this. Thank you.
No, thank you, Lisa and Mary, for that just amazing research and talk. I obviously work in downtown Tacoma, and I'll never be on campus or in downtown Tacoma again without thinking about this in a very different way. We do have a couple of great questions from audience members that I'm going to read. So the first one is in Fife, not all of the Japanese families could afford to send their children to the Fife Japanese Language School. And the question is, do you have any ideas to what percentage of Tacoma Japanese families were not able to afford to send their children to the language school?
It's a great question. We can't provide a percentage. We do know that while many of those we interviewed felt that every child went, it's not true. Not every family sent their child to the language school. But we also do know that there were scholarships and that some families very quietly provided funds. Well, Mary, if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, just that, like Lisa says, there were families who kind of quietly provided money so that children could go. Yeah, so I think that there was kind of an effort. It was a community effort to make sure that the families who wanted to participate, and not all, and again, as Lisa says, not everyone did, but the vast majority of the children did attend the language school. So they wanted to make sure that that was feasible for everybody.
Great, thank you. So the next question, was the Tacoma Japanese community insulated for the 1893 panic? And this person says, I own the house that RA Triple built in 1890 on North Stevens. He owned the largest Tacoma shoe store, and his fortunes really turned, and he ended up in Seattle on Capitol Hill. And then following up on that with the question to the specific historic period of significance, were they affected, or how were they affected by the 1923 crash?
Well, we can say that this was not a wealthy community. I think everybody knows that. There were some families that had businesses that allowed them to buy a car, but it was predominantly a walking scale community because people didn't have cars. There's some great comments from some of the Nisei about how these were not, when they lived in the hotels, those are the families that felt like they didn't have as many economic resources. These were not fancy places. It was a way to live in one's business. And they actually, looked at the families within the Japanese community that own their own homes as being, more economically stable. So there's clearly class differences. And the Depression, many of the interviews said that they never felt like their families got out of it. That was such a struggle.
I think the other thing that Lisa and I both recognized as we were doing our interviews is that we were talking to people, in their 70s and their 80s, and they're reflecting back on their childhoods. And as a result, their memories are of their childhood world. So they're not necessarily, they are aware, like Lisa says, of the fact that, well, we live in a hotel, they live in a house, and they're aware of some of those class differences, but not in the same way that it not kind of in that more kind of adult way that you might. They understood what the impact on them, on their families were, but they didn't have that broader kind of vision. So that was one of the things that Lisa and I had to remember when we were doing our interviews, is that we were really talking to people about these memories of their own childhoods, and that all of our memories are selective and incomplete. And so we construct these worlds out of our memories. And so anyway, I just kind of wanted to throw that in the sense that our information, although we did, additional research, we're not Asian Americanists. And so a lot of our research we have to recognize is pretty subjective in terms of the Nisei memories, and how do we put that together, and how do we tell a story from that was kind of an interesting part of the challenge.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this evening, that the narratives were also so rooted in place. They were so much about, and we think about it when we talk about our own childhood, right? We went here, we did this, this was my home, then we moved here. You know, my father would walk back to the Tide Flats, but we lived in the downtown area, you know, to work in the sawmill and so on. And that was, it really struck us that their own kind of sense of who they were was quite spatial. And then recognizing that, frankly, the destruction of the community was a spatial form of power. Being, stuck in the camps is, a very clear form of spatial control, with guns pointing in and fences. So, that we're not answering your question directly because we don't have those details, but if there are these other pieces, and even just hearing some of the history that this person has provided it's also a spatial, right? It's also kind of being in Tacoma and then leaving and going to Seattle, which is an interesting type of relationality for that, secondary city of Tacoma.
Great, thank you. So there are a couple more questions. The next one is wondering if there were any cultural objects or even everyday objects that were saved from the buildings that held Japanese-owned businesses as the community was forced into incarceration. And then there's a follow-up to that. Were there any organizations formed to hold and protect personal or business property that had to be left behind?
A lot of people tried to store possessions at the Japanese language school. And some people, after returning to Tacoma, we mentioned earlier that most people didn't return to Tacoma after they were released from the camps. But some who did actually lived in the Tacoma Japanese Language School for a period of time till they could kind of get back on their feet. There were some kind of, individual efforts to store items for people. In terms of artifacts, there were some books. A lot of the stuff just kind of fell into disrepair, or it was sold hastily. One of the things that we found was Japanese language newspaper. There were actually, over a period of time, there were several different Japanese language newspapers that published in Tacoma, and some advertisements in the spring of 1942, right, as the incarceration process was underway, of secondhand shops in Tacoma saying, "Hey, ladies and gentlemen of the Japanese community, bring your stuff here, we'll give you a good price." Really sad to see that, but yeah, anyway, I think the question is about any artifacts that remain, and yes, there were some artifacts on the University of Washington campus. There are some framed examples of some of the calligraphy, some of the pedagogical materials that were used and found remaining in the language school. So there is some of that.
Yeah, and there are some local activists. Tamiko Nomura has been doing a remarkable job of keeping this conversation alive and making sure that there are all sorts of ways that this is documented. So she is somebody to reach out to on that front. But the reality is, as Gail Dubrow, one of the experts in historic preservation, has said, this is the disassembling of Japanese America. The fact that there were no structures in place to save these districts. There's nothing. I mean, even the tools that a city like Tacoma has, such as historic preservation designation, they're very limited. And we don't have that kind of district, historic district designation at all. So it's possible that could have saved some of these buildings, but nothing's, it's not in place. So it takes all of us.
Great.
Libby,
yeah.
sorry, I'm going to interrupt because you said something that means a lot to me, which is that you know, Lisa, Libby, we all work down at UWT. We're all in that area, you know, on a, if not daily basis, at least weekly basis. And what you said is that you won't be in that area again without thinking of this. And, you know, I think of it now all the time when I'm in that area, walking by these vacant lots where a family home was and where children played and where lives were lived, and to see that it's all gone is really poignant, very poignant. So, you know, I hope that people are, you know, begin to think of that and kind of develop an awareness of that.
Yeah, well, I think anyone who sees this program or reads your book, I don't know how they could leave without taking that with them. So I do have two more questions. And I think we have just a couple more minutes before the next part of this program starts. So there's a question, some of the walking distances seem rather long, and did any of the children ride streetcars or, after spring of 1938, buses to or from the school?
Definitely had narratives of streetcars and a bus from, I don't know if you remember, like the very first slide where we added the red dots, but down in South Tacoma, there was also a group of families. And one of the people that lived there, she took the bus up to the language school. But they walked a lot. So back and forth across the, you know, now the 11th Street Bridge to the Tide Flats, it's a few miles. They walked.
And they would say that we walked and walked and walked and walked. So more than one person commented on that.
Great. And so the last question is, does Tacoma have a Japanese language school today? And if so, do you know how it compares to the one that you've been talking to us about?
I don't know for sure. There may be, I know there's a Chinese language school. And I think that there's some informal, I shouldn't say that. I can't answer that question. But there's not a building that I know of that is kind of a core building in terms of any functioning as any kind of a central location.
Yeah. And the only building that is in its original use still is the Buddhist temple on Fawcett.
Okay, well, this is perfect. It is 7 o'clock. We got all the questions, and I just want to thank Lisa and Mary again. I also want to thank the museum and the museum staff for helping us host these talks with our UW scholars and researchers. And so I am going to turn it back over to the staff so that they can move on with the second part of the program. I just want to say again to the audience, thank you so much for coming to this talk in this virtual way. And I hope you'll continue to come to the scholarly selections, which we try to have one a month during our academic year.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you everybody for continuing to join us in this program. And right now I would like to turn it over to Gwen Whiting, who will be introducing the film.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for staying with us to enjoy this film. We've been talking about the story of a community, and now we're going to dive down a little deeper into the story of an individual and their influence on Washington. So we are here to watch Fujitaro Kubota and His Garden, which is a documentary film that examines the enduring dreams and legacy of immigrant and nurseryman Fujitaro Kubota, a self-taught gardener who built a thriving landscape business and through many years of work and challenges, toiled and shaped a landmark Japanese garden in South Seattle. While incarcerated at the Minidoka concentration camp in Idaho during World War II, Kubota also created a memorable garden in the desert where he was held. As you watch the film, please take note of your questions because we will be holding a discussion, conversation, and question and answer with Joy Okazaki and Mayumi Tsudakawa, who have joined us here this evening. Thank you. So we'd like to invite you all to participate in discussion with Joy Okazaki and Mayumi Tsudakawa. So I will ask you at this time to please feel free to put questions in the chat while I introduce our two speakers. Joy Okazaki is a founding board member of the Kubota Garden Foundation and was involved with starting the nonprofit 501c3 to support Kubota Garden in 1989, after the city of Seattle purchased the garden from the Kubota family. The foundation was created to support, enhance, and perpetuate Kubota Garden within the spirit and vision of Fujitaro Kubota and his son Tom Kubota in cooperation with the city of Seattle. The foundation runs a variety of programs and events at the garden and is a constant community focus on the garden in a changing city environment. In addition to the film, the foundation also published a book, Spirited Stone, Lessons from Kubota Garden, which is currently featured in an exhibition at the Gold Gallery at the UW College of Built Environments through March 12th. So be sure to go see that. Joy grew up within a mile of the Kubota Garden. Her 30+ years as an architect, project manager, and construction manager has intersected with her volunteer work at the foundation. She manages large capital projects, does copious fundraising and grant writing, oversees volunteer programs, and leads efforts to celebrate the history of the garden in order to plan for its future. I'd also like to welcome Mayumi Tsudakawa, who is an independent writer and editor. She co-edited several multicultural literary anthologies, including The Forbidden Stitch, Asian American Women's Literary Anthology from Calyx Books, which received the Before Columbus Foundation's American Book Award. She also edited They Painted from Their Hearts, Pioneer Asian American Artists from the Wayne Luke Museum, and also Edge Walking on the Western Rim, New Writings by 12 Northwest Writers, Sasquatch Books. As part of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau, she focused on political challenges faced by Japanese Americans and also on Washington's early feminist artists and writers. She is a freelance writer with recent articles in South Seattle Emerald, International Examiner, and the Densho Encyclopedia. She is on the program team for Asian films at the Seattle International Film Festival. Tsudakawa previously was manager of grants to organizations at the Washington State Arts Commission and also executive director of the King County Arts Commission. She received her master's degree in communications and her bachelor's degree in East Asian studies at the University of Washington. Her master's thesis is one of the few studies of pre-war Japanese American newspapers, and she was born in Seattle. I hope that you'll both join me in welcoming them to our conversation tonight. So I'd like to begin by sharing a moment that personally has really resonated with me since the first time that I saw this film. And that was this image of when Fujitaro and his family knew that they were going to camp, but not what future awaited them when they got there, and the fact that he took seeds. And when he arrived in Minidoka, he found he could not grow seeds, and so he built a garden of stone. And that act of resistance really remains with me personally. So I think about that and think about how he was able to overcome so many obstacles, incarceration, rebuilding the garden, that could have prevented the creation of the gardens that we know today. I wonder if you could each share something about how you feel he was able to overcome these obstacles. And I'd also like to invite those of you at home to consider sharing in the chat what we can learn from this today.
Joy, why don't you go ahead first?
That's what happens when you're on Zoom and Facebook Live. Don't know who's going to speak first. I think, it's just amazing to me, had the war not even happened, even just the resilience and perseverance of this person who started off, not as a formally trained gardener, to decide to grow a business, a landscape business, decided to market it based on word of mouth and off previous work. And then just to even think about owning a piece of land that then became a nursery, that then became their home, and then to lose it all during the war, and then to come back and to rebuild it even into a bigger business. I mean, the fact that he did Seattle University's campus over years after the war is just a testament to his resilience. And, you know, I think many of the Issei pioneers, and Mayumi would know this better than I, but many of the Issei pioneers came with that spirit, you know, and I don't know where it comes from. You know, it's somewhere in my heritage as well, but, you know, it's just, you know, you're in awe of that, you know, with no technology like we have now, with no you know, easy way to communicate or advertise or things like that, someone that could start from very humble means could build a business and leave us with such a large legacy.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on this point. I do have to bring up my my parents. My dad, George Tsutakawa, was Kibe, or artist, born in the US, raised in Japan. And so he had a lot of art training in Japan. And my mother also was born in the US, raised in Japan. And in, you know, now I've forgotten the years, the late 70s or early 80s, they hired Mr. Kubota, Kubota Sensei, to create a garden in their, at their home in the Mount Baker district, large backyard. And from what was said in the film, I feel like there is a commonality with my dad. And my dad used to say, oh, we're Shinto and we're Buddhist. And there's that strength of that innate feeling for nature. That's what one of the speakers said, that amongst the immigrants of a certain period, that they contributed to the development of the arts in the Pacific Northwest through this innate feeling for nature. So my dad also respected and loved the rocks and the water and the trees and the plants and the oysters and clams. But I feel like that important element of Mr. Kubota came out not because he studied it, not because he was a graduate of some landscaping school or training, but that was a very important innate respect and creativity that he had. So his love for nature, the Shinto and Buddhist innate feeling for stones and water and trees, that is a theme, I feel.
We have a comment actually from the audience, and I'm going to apologize if I mispronounce this individual's name, but Antu Harvey is asking, Mr. Kubota was from Shikoku. Here in Holualoa, we are currently restoring a 1925 monument for the Shikoku Hinro 88 Sacred Places miniature pilgrimage that was here in this Kona village. We want to learn more about how to preserve the history and to restore the pilgrimage. Koyasan Mission is still located on part of the property. May we get in touch to learn more, and how might they do that?
Well, if their aim is to restore the pilgrimage, that wouldn't be us. We're not experts on that. That's a Buddhist practice and takes place in Shikoku in Japan. We're concerned with the garden itself here. So I don't know, Joy, if you have some other.
No, that would be my response as well.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think who would be a resource for that. Let me give that some thought.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Good. But an interesting project that they have there.
Yeah, for sure.
Love to see it happen and love to visit there myself.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, and there's a follow-up comment to that. They're actually a historic preservation group, and they're asking more about the landscaping.
Mhm. Yeah, go ahead, Joy.
Well, I was just going to say, for Kubota, for Kubota Garden is actually pretty pretty young in its history, if you think about it, compared with gardens of Japan and gardens and traditions of Japan and the temples of Japan. Starting in 1927, when he first bought 5 acres, it wasn't a garden. It was really a place for him to put nursery stock. It was a place for him to have his business bring stones from the high Cascades and things like that. So, even though we say that the garden started in 1927, that was just when the first 5 acres of property was purchased. And it actually wasn't even purchased by Kubota himself because he couldn't own land.
Right.
So, the display garden started soon after. He did a garden in 1930 that we have aerial images of from the King County used to fly aerial photographs of the area every 10 years or so. So we have a history of that property over the time that he acquired additional acreage and as the nursery developed. And actually what we see today is mostly garden, but when you looked at the garden prior to the war and shortly thereafter, it was more nursery than it was garden. So, preserving that history and finding that history takes a lot of time, a lot of contributions by a lot of different people. And to preserve a landscape actually is somewhat interesting because the landscape constantly grows and changes.
Right.
So, there's a period of significance that people will assign to a landscape. And they'll say that is, how the landscape should be. But as you know, a tree is not going to stay the same size as it was in that period. Maybe it's a 20-year period or something. So we've had many discussions about it. We've worked together with, with Seattle Parks and with the City of Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board in discussing those, parameters by which we would call it a historic landscape. And it's only a portion of the garden that's considered a historic landscape, even though the whole of the 20 acres belong to Mr. Kubota.
That kind of that raises an interesting question. What impact do you think that placing the Kubota Gardens in the middle of an urban city has had? With that in mind, the age of the gardens and the place where it
didn't
sits.
know. He didn't know that the city would come to him. What an absolute natural genius he was, though, to acquire that particular land. I'm sure he looked at the patterns of the sunlight and what was around the area, and it was a wonderful wilderness at the time. So he didn't know that the city would come to him, but we are so lucky that it's remained a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, and doesn't have, gigantic modern buildings surrounding it, or even manufacturing buildings around that area. So what a wonderful legacy. And I do want to point out that what a legacy for the multi-generational visitors, especially younger people, children that can see that a beautiful piece of land can have beautiful plants. And the fact of where it's located is so great for access by all kinds of people in the neighborhood.
I have a question from Juliana. She would like to know how many Japanese gardens, if you happen to know this answer, how many Japanese gardens are there in the Pacific Northwest, and were others built in partnerships with nurseries as well?
Well, of course, the Japanese garden at the Seattle Arboretum is a formal and very well designed and kept garden. And the Japanese garden in Portland is a really significantly beautifully designed and kept garden. And then the Bloedel garden, of course, is a magnificent piece unto itself. I don't know if I would call the Seattle U garden a significant Japanese garden because it's really surrounding the buildings that are
There's
there.
also the Seikei Garden, which was in the pathway of the third runway and was actually relocated to the Highline, what is it called? The Highline Botanical Garden.
Oh.
It was actually a nursery. The Seikeis used to have a nursery and sold plants and things and had a beautiful little garden there at their home and nursery. And it took quite a bit of effort, and thanks to the Port of Seattle's money, they documented that garden, and then they relocated at the Highline Botanical Garden. So it has a similar story as the Kubota Garden.
Good.
I mentioned earlier when introducing the two of you that the Kubota Garden Foundation had published a book, Spirited Stone, sorry, Lessons from Kubota Garden. Could the two of you tell us a little bit about the book and the contributors? And there's the book.
Yeah, Joy, go ahead.
Well, this, it was interesting. We actually had been wanting to publish a book for a number of years as the foundation. And when we first explored it, we learned how difficult it was to publish a book and how expensive it was and how it's pretty much a labor of love to do it. And we originally thought we were going to do a coffee table book, and it would just be a whole bunch of pretty pictures with a little bit of history and a little bit about the garden, a little bit about, Fujitaro Kubota. But when we sort of, we got excited about it, and then we kind of tabled the idea, and we thought, well, we need to do that. We need to collect. We had all these photographs from the family and from various community members, and we thought, we need to sort of archive those and figure out how to index them so that we could actually use them. And we found that was in and of itself quite a project. And then we talked about doing this film. And so when the ideas came about again, and actually Mayumi was one of my first conversations when I said, how do we find grant money, to do these kinds of things? And at the time, Mayumi was at the state, and she gave me like half an hour of her time, but she said, Joy, you need to pursue the archives grant, or you need to pursue grants to go after and do these things. And so we were very fortunate. We've had a very active board of volunteers, and we had a team of people that actually were interested in doing the book. And they pitched the idea of doing a book that sort of represented the garden. It wasn't necessarily a picture book, even though it's quite a nice coffee table book with beautiful pictures, but it became a book that represented the people that come and use and appreciate Kubota Garden from so many different perspectives. So it became an anthology before we knew it. And we thought we would add poetry, and we got a photographer, and we mixed in historical photos with new photos. And the book has gotten so much wonderful acclaim. And so many people are interested in it just because there's something for everybody in the book. And it very much reflects the garden. I will also say that we were, at the time, we weren't quite ready for the book because the archives hadn't quite gotten put together, but we were doing those concurrently. And then we thought we would do a film with the book, and we started out doing the film with the book, and then we decided they were going to take different paths. So the film, as you see, is more of oral history, talking to various people who know about the garden, using a lot of the historic images to illustrate the story, and also contemporary photographs to show how the garden has changed over time. The book does the same thing, but it has a different feel. The book has poetry, the book has academic essays, the book has short stories. Mayumi has a history piece that she did for us, and actually the publisher decided to make it into a fold-out timeline, which actually made it even more powerful. And we found that it lent itself to the exhibit that's at the University of Washington so easily, which also was an opportunity for us to show a master plan update that we recently did as well. So, that said, the book is available online. It's available at our website, kubotagarden.org, or with our publisher. And I think he's got a site, spiritedstone.org, I believe.
So I would like to jump in here, and of course, many other arts organizations had the same situation where, lo and behold, there was a pandemic. It just, I mean, you were all set to do this great rollout and have these great opening parties and readings and so on. And actually what happened was that the pandemic stopped that. However, I think you put together a really good series of readings, using the talents of different writers in the book who happen to live in different places, and they became Zoom events, which really turned out well. I thought they were, lively and really colorful, and really great to hear the readers speaking, about their pieces in the book.
Yeah, it's been wonderful because we've got such a variety of people that have contributed to it, and it's been a surprise. We our publisher told us, our goal was to have an evergreen, and I'm like, what's an evergreen? And he says, a book that just continues to sell. And as soon as we have our visitor center, it'll be on sale there.
Any of those Zoom events that you mentioned online for folks to watch?
I think some of them are, like Wing Luke had an event that featured our book, and it's recorded. I'm not sure if they have it easily accessible online. Town Hall actually had an event, and that featured Charles Johnson and Marcus Green, actually the editor and publisher of the South Seattle Emerald. But we could put a list of those together, I'm sure, and then make them I think there may be links to them on our website. Our web people do all these things, put things there that I don't even know exist.
Yeah, it's the same for us as well. So the book sounds amazing, and you've talked a bit about the process of it, but there's so many wonderful contributors. How did you get people involved?
Well, the poets actually were a juried competition. We had a little committee that actually put a call out to many of the poets that were in the area, and many of the ones that ended up in the book were poet laureates, the state poet laureate or the ex-state poet laureate or the city of Seattle's poet laureate. And so we were very fortunate to get contributions from, name people. And then the others were kind of a mix, as the publishers started thinking about the different pieces, how many different perspectives there were about the garden. He was really good about organizing them into, here's history, here's the content or the, spiritual aspects of the garden, here's, the different, just experiential ways to organize the book. And it's just been amazing. I mean, we had no one that that has participated in the book has said, oh, I don't have time to help you promote the book, or I didn't, it wasn't.
Well, the cool thing is that these are actually pretty famous writers, but they were all familiar with the garden. Yes. Because it's been such an inspirational draw for creative people.
Yes. Over years. I mean,
many years.
Quite. Yeah.
And I hope it inspires several more of our viewers watching tonight. I would like to ask one last question before we go, and this is from Mary Michael. She'd like to know what are some of the future plans for the garden?
Future plans for the garden. Wow. How far out? Right now, actually, we're under construction. I think Mayumi was there recently, but we're under construction with our first restroom building. We're pretty excited about that because the city has owned the property for over 30 years. And we've, for a number of years, there were no facilities. Then there were honey buckets, and now there's finally going to be restrooms this summer. So we're pretty excited about that.
But I do want to jump in there and have you make sure you mention the pavilion, because that was a good development and it now can be used, rented for events.
Yes, but it's not future plans. We do have other plans. So we did have a terrace overlook. That's what Mayumi's referring to. And actually, you know, the foundation's been involved since the city's owned the property. So the development of this Tom Kubota stroll garden down in the core of the garden, the entry gates, which Mayumi's brother actually was wonderful enough to create for us at the for the entrance of the garden, the terrace overlook, which was built in 2014. Those were all sort of stepping stones towards, you know, a larger master plan update, which we did in 2019. And in that includes the current restrooms, a parking lot expansion because visitorship has been increasing exponentially. The pandemic actually helped that because people were staying at home and needed to get outdoors. And it was a great place for respite for that time, you know, for 2020 and 2021. But we're expanding the parking lot. We're studying the stormwater, trying to make improvements to that so that it would clean up the ponds in the garden and then the creek that feeds into Lake Washington. And we have a visitor center in the plans. You know, we feel like there needs to be a presence there to tell this story, to talk to people, to do programs and let people know, you know, it's a large enough facility and with enough people coming to it that we really feel an obligation to interpret the garden and share it with people. So we're hoping, you know, that happens, but each step of the way, you know, it's funding and it's a balance. This year, we're actually hiring our first executive director. We're in the process of doing that. So we're growing with the gardens, you know, visitations and the city's ownership as we're maturing into the next 20 to 30 years.
You know, if I could jump in, this is non sequitur, of course, but when we were mentioning different gardens, I do want to give a shout out for the bonsai garden. And I forgot the correct name of it, but it's formerly a Weyerhaeuser project and now it's independent, located in
Bonsai
Museum. It's really beautiful and it has so many lovely Japanese inspired and Japanese created bonsai plants. So that's part of this garden effect in the Northwest.
Well, thank you both so much for coming and sharing your knowledge and your
You're welcome.
expertise in this film. I do want to encourage everyone who is here with us tonight that if you did not get a chance to see the whole program, it will be archived online. You can reach it through our YouTube page after it's been posted and also on Facebook. The museum itself, while we are doing our programs virtually, our galleries are still open. And in fact, you can see behind me on the screen our gallery and our special exhibition entitled Remembrance, the Legacy of Executive Order 9066, where you can learn more about the incarceration of people of Japanese ancestry during World War II. We have also tonight just opened a virtual tour of the exhibition. So if you'd like to get a little preview of that, please feel free to visit our website at washingtonhistory.org. Thank you both so much for your time, and we hope to visit the garden soon.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I'm going.